Welcome to the Time of the Reason podcast show. We're not looking for ratings. We are not here to support and to create sensationalism. We are not here to entertain. We are here to give due diligence to the pressing human, economic, environmental, political, and social issues that affect humankind. We are here to promote thinking. Now, more than ever, is the time to revive reason. Unless we do so, humankind is riding a one-way runaway train into oblivion. Think about it. We must think. Thank you for listening again to another episode of the Time of the Reason podcast show. Let's get started. Hey, Dan, how you doing, buddy?
Doing great, John. Good to see you.
Awesome. I want to welcome everybody back to another episode of the Time of the Reason podcast show, where we incite critical thinking. We implore people to use logic and reason. We ask them to give stories their due diligence and to use a little bit of common sense when it comes to deciphering all of the information that's out there. And of course, if you've been following us, Dan and I have been talking about information for a while. He is a trained engineer who is very fascinated by information and its impact on people. And he's come up with some brilliant findings. One of the things we're going to talk about today is misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and provocation in light of Representative Ilhan Omar's postings this past Saturday on Twitter, where she posted some dead children and in big letters said, genocide being committed by Israel again. And very inflammatory, very provocative, very hateful, actually. And so I didn't want to go to the American news outlets to figure out what was going on. So I went around the world and started to see that, first of all, it was a fraud. It was a lie. The picture that she posted on Twitter, which she took down pretty quickly after that, was from a gas attack in Syria back in 2013. And it had nothing to do with the current situation in Gaza or in Israel, Palestine. And, it just makes me sick. And the reason why it makes me sick is because this very channel, YouTube, took down one of my channels for posting a video that supported Jason Aldean. Of course, they blamed it on something else. I had one of my channels taken off, censored, canceled right here on YouTube. And for telling the truth, not pointing the finger or anything like that. And, there was no warning. There was nothing. A citizen of the United States of America, of course, it's a private platform. And obviously, I'm not sure if they're actually a friend of free speech. But you have somebody that's in our House of Representatives, and if you give it due diligence, this person, Ilhan Omar, has been inciting and provoking for a while. My question is this, Dan. Why is she allowed to do that, and citizens like myself can't? Let's talk about that for a second. Is she fanning the flames of hate, getting away with it?
Could we be dealing with a two-sided justice system, John?
I've heard that before, and this last president that we had, President Donald Trump, didn't a bunch of people say that he was inciting hate with all these MAGA people, and they censored him, and now he's under a gag order. Yeah. He can't even tell the prosecutor that he's a thug. I mean, what's going on with free speech in America? What's happening to us, Dan?
Well, Representative Omar has committed an act of war. She's inserted herself into the war. She's an active participant in the war, same as if she was shooting off rockets or hand grenades or shooting a rifle. So she's actively supported the war effort on part of the Palestinian by passing along, misinformation. And disinformation.
And propaganda,
And so, yes. So, number one is above all, the message that you keep sending is to your audience is practice critical thinking. And you know me, that's what I stand for, coming from the world of the STEM world, if you will. But consider that whenever you hear a piece of information, one, consider the source, two, consider the context, and evaluate the information from the standpoint of, does it make logical sense? The picture that she put up was propaganda from an earlier wars, from the when Syria was being accused of gassing its own citizens. So somebody used their critical thinking capabilities and exposed that for what it was. But onward, all of the information that we're seeing as a result of war with the current Israeli-Palestinian situation is it's all propaganda. All of it. You're not going to get any straight information. And the activity of intelligence services is to provide disinformation to the populace in the form of propaganda to advance a cause. So, folks, when you hear anything like the hospitals being bombed by the Israelis, put it in context. What's the context? Well, we're in a war situation. Okay, is there any, consider the source? Well, the source is Palestinians. They were the ones that drove across the border and started massacring civilians. Okay, go through this process, a critical thinking process, and what you'll see is we don't have the ability to determine what happened at the Gaza hospital, because both sides, it's to their advantage to propagandize this in order to try and gain public sympathy for their cause. So, folks, hate to say it, but anything you see coming out of the news is unreliable. So you're going to have to make up your own decision based on your knowledge, your historical knowledge of the area, your historical knowledge of what has happened in the past, and your historical knowledge based upon what are the goals of the various individuals that we're dealing with. What are the goals of the Israeli Defense Force? What are the goals of the Palestinian Hamas and Hezbollah? And you have to make the decision for yourself, folks. And anybody that jumps on that bandwagon and says, gee whiz, look at what the fill in the blank, whether it's Israeli or Palestinian, rocket did to the hospital. Well, does it make sense for Israel to have bombed a hospital, first of all? No, not at all. That would be bad juju in the world of propaganda. Is there any military advantage to bombing the hospital? Absolutely not. And in fact, you've professed that they will leave the hospitals alone. But the Palestinian army, I do know that they have built headquarters underneath hospitals. So, what does my critical thinking tell me about this? So my critical thinking tells me that it was a misfire. It's an unfortunate accident of war, and that where the various groups are using it to their political and propagandal advantage. So my choice is to believe it was a misfired Palestinian rocket, and it's unfortunate, but Palestinians that were killed in the hospital, you guys elected Hamas. They're in there for your purposes. And if there is no distinction between you as a Palestinian civilian and Hamas, there is none. So, bear the brunt. I'm sorry. It's war. If you don't want to fight a war, say so, and get out of it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, thank you for taking us through that critical thought process, which leads me back to Ilhan, Representative Omar, who has a history now. When you start to give due diligence and use some critical thinking, deductive reasoning, you start to see that she has a history of anti-Semitism, of inciting the population or those who would, hate the Jews to make them hate them even more. And if you look around college campuses, not all, but some of the college campuses that are allowing people to protest, it's kind of troubling to see these 30 somethings or 20 somethings or these young people that are being incited by people like Ilhan on our campuses, many of them masked, just like the terrorists, proclaiming allegiance to the Palestinians who, the terrorist Palestinians. I'm not going to say that all Palestinians are terrorists. God forbid. They're not. There's a lot of innocent people, and probably a lot of them in that hospital, who were just injured and killed by what we are saying is more than likely a misfire, which does happen. By the way, the research that I did, rockets fail. Rockets explode on the pad, rockets lift off and then explode and go in different directions. And if it's a homemade rocket, which we understand through credible intelligence, it's probably gonna fail. And unfortunately, it failed on these people at the hospital. That being said, it's a mess. Free speech is a mess, and it's being perverted by some pretty nefarious people. So if Ilhan was fraudulent, putting out this photograph that's over 10 years old, I would say that anything she says is probably, you'd have to raise an eyebrow, and I would really not listen to anything she says. We know where her heart lies, and I've heard before, if it smells like a skunk, walks like a skunk, probably is a skunk. And I would say that Ilhan is a skunk, and anything she puts out stinks because it's not true. And she has fallen right into the game of the terrorist, and she is inciting innocent people who don't know better, who aren't using critical thinking skills for sure, logic or reason, to fall lockstep with the terrorist. It's sad. It's sad to witness this, and it's sad to witness censorship and cancellation and ridicule and finger pointing for those of us who want to get at the truth. That's sad. Things like that happen in totalitarian states that understand authoritarianism, and it's just it's an interesting place where we're at. That's all I can say. So, what advice, besides the advice you've already given, Dan, what advice can you give listeners who really want the truth? And people want the truth. Nobody likes being lied to.
My advice to your listeners is that if somebody demonstrates weak character, like Representative Ilhan Omar has demonstrated, and has demonstrated that they lie to get their point across, that we don't have enough time to evaluate these situations over and over and over and over again. If they've proven themselves to be of poor character, stop listening to them. Treat them as any information that comes from this source is not reliable information. I will not waste my time even listening to it, because I need to evaluate whether other information I'm receiving has any validity to it. So consider the source, consider your history, and move on.
Yeah, great advice, Dan. I want to thank listeners for coming back to us again. And, if Ilhan ever gets a hold of this, my advice to her or to you is quit being a skunk. Be credible, be a leader. Don't fall lockstep with those who don't have the same values that we have here in America and in other free countries around the world. People don't like being lied to. So come back to us again for another episode of The Time of the Reason. And it is the time of the reason. Use your reason, use logic, use some common sense. And don't just survive, thrive. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Time of the Reason podcast show. Now it's time to think. Logic and reason work. It's only common sense. Do your part.